Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today, I want to make what I sometimes call a Reads and Rambles video. At some point, I hope to get back to my old style of Reads and Rambles, where I not only talked about what I had finished reading that week, but what interesting things I might have done that week, and some of the most interesting things I had seen or heard about on Booktube and beyond. Today, I just have two things to share. A discussion about the book I finished for Victober, but first, just a little about the Booktube meetup I had this past week. Early Wednesday morning, I hopped on the subway and headed down to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., where I met Greg of the channel Another Bibliophile Reads, who lives nearby, and Alan of the channel Big Hard Books and Classics, who had flown into D.C. from the other side of the country to spend a few days with Greg. For those of you who don't know, the National Mall is not a shopping pavilion, but a very long, grassy plaza bordered by many museums of art and history and science, etc., as well as many monuments and memorials. The three of us picked up coffee to go at a nearby coffee shop, and we walked from fairly near the U.S. Capitol down the mall all the way past the tall Washington Monument and the reflecting pool to the Lincoln Memorial. Then we walked back up the other side of the mall, past the U.S. History Museum and the Natural History Museum, to the west wing of the National Gallery with its large collection of classic art. The East Wing, with its contemporary collection, is next door, connected underground. We looked at early Dutch and French paintings, etc., and then poked around in the early American section, where Greg and I discovered that we both love the John Singleton Copley painting, Watson and the Shark. What a wonderful morning. It was a pleasure to get to know both Greg and Alan. I'm really pleased the two of you reached out to me and let me join you. Okay, on to the next part of the video. In the latter part of the century, Rhoda comes to the city in search of financial self-sufficiency, which she hopes to get from secretarial employment. She lives with her friend Mary in a 19th century house. Emphasized in this particular work, we see themes like women's role in the workforce, the assumptions and discrimination that women face there and in society at large, the problems of being an unmarried woman and the problems of being a married woman, issues of extramarital romantic relationships, and also infidelity, as well as the experience of one female character's addiction. No, I'm not talking about Mary Tyler Moore and Rhoda Morgenstern from the television series The Mary Tyler Moore Show. I'm thinking about late 19th century London, where Mary and Rhoda are major characters in George Gissing's book, The Odd Women. This novel was the first thing I read for Victober this year, to meet the challenge to read a piece of new woman literature, the challenge put to us by Katie at Books and Things. Odd women in this book and in society at the time refers to the so-called redundant women who were left over at the end of the equation when the other men and women had paired off in marriage. Years ago, I read quite a bit of sort of new woman utopian novels, such as Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, essentially feminist fantasy novels written at about the same time as Gissing's book. While they were fascinating historically, none of them were particularly well written. But The Odd Woman is a work of realism, fitting in better with works like Ibsen's A Dollhouse or Kate Chopin's The Awakening, and I absolutely loved it. The plotline is compelling, and the political themes of the book are absolutely fascinating. This is the first time I've read it, but it's been on my radar for a while. I even copied this quote down from literary scholar Rowan Mateson in my Commonplace book. Quote, The odd woman is what Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen would be if Mr. Bennet died before Bingley ever came to Netherfield. That is, it's about women who don't necessarily have a place to go and who don't have high hopes on the marriage market. What happens then? The Odd Woman is a story quite explicitly about the movement for women's emancipation. Of course, I find this interesting because of how Gissing shows real historical developments at the end of the 19th century, but I also find it fascinating as a newish kind of literature. In almost all books written during this era, with young female main characters, the marriage plot, or at least a domestic plot, dominates the book. Gissing, by choosing to write about working women, helps introduce a really new plot line to literature, a plot focused on women's lives and their decisions more broadly. Yes, this book does talk about how characters pursue romantic relations and even marriage, but the successful resolution of those relationships, well, it isn't the point of the book in the end. What the novel is about is the need for women to receive an education, partly because so many women will, at some point in their lives, need to support themselves. Fundamentally, this is a book about the importance of work and how that work can bring both personal fulfillment and economic independence to those who do that work. Mary and Rhoda have established a program to teach unmarried middle-class women to do secretarial work. That kind of work was expanding rapidly in the late 19th century with technological advances such as the invention of the typewriter. Before this period, women in search of employment were basically limited to the caring professions, that is, being a nanny or a companion or a governess or perhaps a nurse. But because of the need for this new kind of worker, jobs for women became more diversified. In fact, the entire secretarial profession started to be seen as appropriate, mostly only for women. It's definitely a little strange that this book is filled with talk about work, but we rarely see any scenes with people actually doing labor. Instead, we have a whole lot of scenes of people enjoying their moments of leisure, whether they're eating special meals together, walking around the park, or going on vacation. I think that sense that leisure is important in their lives emphasizes that this book is about middle-class people, not the working class, and not people living in even deeper poverty who had less time for leisure pursuits. I think Gissing's emphasis on middle-class people is often something that today's readers criticize. Mary and Rhoda are pretty blunt about the fact that they're only interested in helping middle-class women acquire secretarial education and work. Only those they deem deserving qualify for their help. While clearly these lines come across as terribly classist to modern readers, I don't think it's fair to explicitly blame Gissing for this argument. It was very much the general opinion of social reformers of the late 19th century. Gissing wanted to write about his society as it was, and those ideas were very much part of that society. One of the interesting things here is that despite the fact that Gissing is writing about middle-class women, some of them are absolutely living in poverty, struggling to even get enough to eat. I've only talked about Rhoda and Mary so far, but there are 3 other women who were also central to this book. The sisters Monica, Virginia, and Alice. They were raised in a middle-class household, but after their parents died, the sisters struggled to make ends meet. The latter 2 especially are regularly going hungry. They make so little money that they negotiate their rent to exclude board and instead cook as cheaply as possible in their hired rooms. Often they can only afford a bowl of rice with a little butter. And their bodies are literally being broken down by their malnutrition. The physical suffering of the bodies of women, Gissing is showing here, happens because of their poverty in practice, even if they were raised middle class. And women's physical suffering is a recurring part of the plot. I also find it interesting that Gissing makes it fairly clear that Mary and Rhoda, who live together, are not romantic partners, that they're heterosexual. While I love to read classic novels about close relationships with women who are romantic partners or might be romantic partners, I think here, by having the two women bound together only by their political commitments, Gissing's able to give us a much more powerful portrayal of the importance of their work together. There are a lot of painful and difficult situations talked about in this book, and I know some of you might be turned off by that, but there's an incredible moment of hope at the end, not overdrawn or fake, but still a promise that better times seem to be on the horizon. To wrap up, having this plot line revolve around women's lives outside of marriage, as well as about the problems women face in hierarchical marriages, we get such a different kind of story than what we see in the incredibly popular marriage plot that dominated so much literature about women before the late 19th century. And honestly, that dominates so much literature written about women even now, too. Gissing isn't telling us the most obvious stories, and he doesn't choose to wrap up the stories he does tell in the most obvious ways either. If you haven't read The Odd Women yet, I definitely give it a strong recommendation. Well, that will do it for this video. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.